Order. I've called Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does the Environment Canterbury Temporary Commissioners and Improved Water Management Bill fulfil his intention to, quote, remove particular regulatory roadblocks to water storage and irrigation in Canterbury?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the biggest regulatory issue in Canterbury has been the absence of a regional water plan. 19 years after the RMA was passed, there is still no organised system for managing water in that region. I'm sure everyone wants to see an effective plan in place, and passing this bill is a step towards achieving just that.
Supplementary.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the proposed Hurunui irrigation scheme one of the water storage and irrigation projects in Canterbury he would like to see advanced as a result of this bill?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that would depend on whether it could achieve its mixed objectives of preserving the environmental responsibilities we have along with our economic growth objectives, and we'll only know that when it's been referred back to the Commissioners to review the whole project.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did any Cabinet Ministers declare conflicts of interest in Cabinet discussions about the Environment Canterbury Bill? If so, what were those conflicts of interest?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to the best of my knowledge, I don't recall any conflicts of interest being raised, but I can go and check that for the member.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is he aware that the Agriculture Minister, David Carter, owns a farm with an irrigation consent in the Hurunui district and stands to benefit financially if the proposed Hurunui irrigation scheme goes ahead?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, well, I am aware that he owns a farm in that area. I'm not aware whether he'd benefit from it because, for one thing, the whole matter needs to be considered by the Commissioners.
Supplementary.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Given that this bill, given that the Environment Canterbury Bill will make it easier for the Hurunui irrigation scheme to go ahead, does he believe that David Carter should have declared a conflict of interest in the Cabinet discussions, given that he stands to gain financially if the scheme proceeds?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, referring a matter to the new Commissioners for consideration doesn't raise a conflict of interest, I would have thought. Now, we can check that with the Cabinet Office, but referring something that might happen doesn't actually raise a conflict of interest until it does happen.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given Mr. Carter's ownership, was it appropriate for David Carter to approach...
Order. I apologise to Dr. Russel Norman, and again I say to the government backbenchers, show some courtesy to the member asking the question. I cannot hear his question. Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given this conflict of interest, was it appropriate for David Carter to approach the people who applied for the water conservation order at a function on 3rd September 2009, requesting that they freeze their application for 12 to 18 months while they were in the middle of a judicial process?
The point of order, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Mr. Speaker, a question can only have facts in the question. We often fall short of that, but this given isn't been established as a fact by Dr. Russel Norman, and he's also, in stating that allegation, he's actually casting a slur on a minister who isn't here to take offence, and so in his absence I certainly take offence.
It's a very interesting point that the honourable member raises, that supplementary questions should not contain allegations, certainly not contain allegations perhaps of impropriety, but they're not meant to contain statements of assumed fact anyhow. They're meant to actually ask questions. What I think the best way maybe to handle this is to invite Dr. Russel Norman to rephrase his question in a way that is more consistent with standing orders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was it appropriate for Minister David Carter to approach the people who applied for the water conservation order at a function on 3rd September 2009, requesting that they freeze their application for 12 to 18 months while they were in the middle of a judicial process for a water conservation order?
Order. I'm not sure that realistically altered the question that the member asked. I would have thought he could have worded it in a question instead of making a statement that suggests that the member may have done something that he considers to be inappropriate. He maybe could have phrased it as a question rather than...
To that issue, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the question is it appropriate? This is the Prime Minister who's responsible for his ministers. So
Order, if I just point out my concern is the member is alleging that the Minister did what he's saying, and the House has no validation of that. We don't know whether the Minister in fact did what the member is alleging. And the problem with the question is that if the Minister, the member is implying that if the Minister did in fact do that, it may not have been appropriate, and it may be possible to phrase it in a way that asks a question rather than makes a statement that the Minister did something when the Minister may or may not have done that, because the House, there's no way of validating that supplementary. Speaking the point of order, I'll hear the Honourable Trevor Mallett.
It may help the member to phrase the question somewhere around, would it be appropriate if a minister did? And in that way you could get there.
This guy's a leader.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
I'll hear Dr. Russell Norman.
Mr. Speaker, it may assist you in the House if I table a file note from one of those present when the Minister allegedly approached the applicants for the water conservation order and asked them to hold their application for 12 to 18 months. So I seek leave to table that.
Order. Leave is sought to table a document. Is there any objection to that document being tabled? There is objection. Order. Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallett.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think at that point, when it's been offered and declined by government members, I think it becomes almost impossible for members to, when authentication has been offered, for members to ask questions and be required and have their questions ruled out for lack of authentication.
Order. I hear what the member's saying. I'll invite the member to ask his question because maybe I'm being excessively sensitive about the issue. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was it appropriate for David Carter to allegedly approach the people who applied for the water conservation order at a function on 3rd September 2009, requesting that they freeze their application for 12 to 18 months while they were in the middle of a judicial process to apply for a water conservation order?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to offer a view on wild and unproven allegations from the member, but I would point out that water conservation orders are the matter of the Minister of the Environment, and that is not Mr. Carter.
True.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of David Carter's failure to declare his conflict of interest and the fact that he inappropriately intervened...
Order. No, I hear what the members... I hear the point of order. I can anticipate the point of order. The member must not preface his question with another statement because the Prime Minister has already, in answering a question, explained that in his view there was no conflict of interest involved in this matter. So the member shouldn't start his question in light of failure to comply with a conflict of interest. I invite the member to rephrase his question. Point of order, the Honourable Simon Power.
Speaker, I appreciate the fact that we're trying to work our way through some complex wording, but you'll recall yesterday when a member of this side of the House had 3 opportunities to get a question right, and then at the third opportunity where you were still not happy with the wording, you moved on. I'd ask you to consider a similar set of circumstances which have now occurred in this question.
Indeed, order. No, I don't need to hear order, and I'm considering a point of order. The government backbenchers are testing my patience probably for the first time today, and I suggest they don't do it any further. The difference on this occasion is that it's not all over one question, it's over a further supplementary question, and therefore it's a different situation from yesterday. Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you,
Please,
Mr.
without
Speaker.
the preface.
Is the Prime Minister of the view that Mr. Carter, as Minister of Agriculture, is meeting his high standards of ministerial behaviour when he inappropriately intervened in a water conservation order process and approached the applicants?
Point of order, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Now that is 3.
By my count, it's 2 on this supplementary question.